This week on Faithful Freedom with Taryn Gregson.
I decided, okay, this is an all-out fight for medical freedom. This is an all-out fight for our children. Parents, you on this one, I'm sorry. I just have to say no, no matter what. Move away from fear, get back into faith, and get back into the knowledge that your natural immune system is absolutely amazing. Do everything in your power to boost that.
As a consumer, would you make a significant purchase without first doing your research? Like, let's say you're getting a TV. Wouldn't you look into the different types of TV, different brands, all the bells and whistles that could come with it? Or maybe a significant purchase like a house or a car. Wouldn't you do research if you're building a home on what area you're moving into, the types of floor plans that would work best for your family? Now, what about as a medical consumer? Do you put as much time and research into the medical treatments that you're getting, or do you automatically trust everything that is recommended to you with no fault of your own, as you should? We should all respect those that have been trained in the medical field. But my guest today, Dr. Paul Thomas, a pediatrician, author of the Vaccine Friendly Plan, is here to talk about informed consent. His latest mission is medical freedom, parental rights, and, like I said, informed consent. He believes not in being completely anti-vax, but in educating yourself in what you are putting into your body, into your children's body, how much, how often, and thinks that your medical choices and decisions should be tailored to you, not a one-size-fits-all approach. So we're going to talk to him about some of the statistics behind just vaccines in general, the CDC recommended vaccine plan for your children, and of course the current COVID shot and all that comes with that, but also what it means or doesn't mean to be truly anti-vax and how they're changing the definition of that. So without further ado, let's check out this episode with Dr. Paul Thomas. Freedom is non-negotiable. Mandates, free speech, cancel culture, parental rights. These are real people that have stood up for their freedoms no matter what. Welcome into Faithful Freedom with Taryn Gregson, presented by We the Patriots USA, helping everyday Americans defend their God-given rights. Dr. Paul Thomas, I am so delighted to have you on the Faithful Freedom podcast. You are a pediatrician, author of the Vaccine Friendly Plan and the Addiction Spectrum, and you're also doing a lot of work over at drpaulsfight.com. And I have to say, I had a fellow mom come to me and show me your work, and I started diving into it. And I told my friends over at We the Patriots USA, I've got to get this Dr. Paul Thomas on the podcast. And they're like, hey, he's an old friend of ours. He comes on and helps the organization a lot. So it's funny how it all came together.
This was meant to be, Taryn. Thanks for having me on your show.
Well, thanks. I want to first, before we get into some of the statistics and such, talk about your background, because I think that's so important in light of today's climate. You grew up in South Africa during the apartheid, and you've been pretty vocal to say you're seeing shades of that here right now in America.
Yeah, so it was actually Rhodesia. I went to high school in Swaziland. From age 4 through 18, I was in Southern Africa, which was Rhodesia, Swaziland. My parents ended up in Zambia towards the end. So those were my formative years. And it was during the civil rights movement. The apartheid was alive and well. Rhodesia wasn't much different. I mean, we had swimming pools and fountains for whites only. And my family was involved with the church, and it was the church there that actually was pioneering the freedom fighters. I mean, not the guns, but the whole movement. And so I was in the midst of all that, and it sort of is in my DNA to stand up for what's right. And when you see something wrong, you don't just turn your eye away from it. You stand up for. And in this case, being a pediatrician, boy, did I have an awakening. So I'm just trained at Dartmouth Medical School. I'm a board certified pediatrician until the board took my license away, and then my medical boards dropped my board certifications, but that's another story. But anyway, 30 years plus as a pediatrician. And what I found was my kids weren't doing so well. And that prompted me to start really diving into the actual published science on what's going on with toxins in our world And come to find out there are problems with our vaccine schedule. So that's why I wrote that book, The Vaccine Friendly Plan. And that's not an anti-vaccine book. It's not a pro-vaccine book. It's just the science. And it's that attempt to have you as the parents look at the science and get informed consent. What's at stake here is informed consent. And I mean, the world knows now with the COVID vaccine rollout that informed consent was just tossed out the window. If you're not given the choice, right? Informed consent should be, here are the benefits, here are the risks, here are the alternatives. Whether it's a surgery or a pharmaceutical product, a drug, or an injection, be it a vaccine or a gene therapy like this current injection probably is, you should have the option to say no, right? I mean, that's freedom. So we're living in, I know your show is all about freedom. So this is where there's an alignment here. I started my practice 13 and a half years ago and based it on the foundation of informed consent. And because that's what I saw was not happening in the community. So sort of that's the background that brought me to integrative pediatrics. I left my old practice 13 years ago, started integrative pediatrics based on informed consent. And what I started to see was, as I had more and more patients who were not vaccinating, that just sort of happened naturally because I allowed it. I let parents make the decision. I started seeing my unvaxxed patients were incredibly healthy. But that's just an anecdotal piece of evidence, right? Well, after I wrote that book, The Vaccine Friendly Plan, the medical board started coming after me. It's like, I guess I put a target on myself. And in February of 2019, they sent me a letter, proved that the Vaccine Friendly Plan is as safe as the CDC schedule. That resulted in my hiring an expert to come in, pull all the data. We had de-identified it, shipped it off to my co-author who didn't know what he was looking at. It's all de-identified data, and came up with the publication that's kind of rocked the world, right? So we published relative incidence of office visits and cumulative rates of bill diagnoses along the axis of vaccination, blah, blah, blah. Basically, it's the vaxxed, unvaxxed study that had never been done, that the CDC and the NIH and all the major health plans should have done, should do, should still do. They don't want to do it. And we published it in the International Journal of Environmental Research and Public Health. Vigorous peer-reviewed study. And I'll just show it up briefly for your viewers who can see this. The orange lines are the vaccinated kids in my practice. The blue line are the unvaxxed. And for all these conditions, the more vaccines you have, the greater the health problems. And we found this to be true for asthma, allergic rhinitis, breathing issues, behavioral issues, ADD, ADHD, and all kinds of infections, whether it was ear infections, sinus infections, lung infections, eye infection. I'm going like, wait a minute. I thought vaccines are supposed to prevent infections. Aha. Here's the little secret that you don't really realize if you're just a regular non-scientist, non-pediatrician, non-doctor who really digs into the science. When we study vaccines, we just study one at a time. We look for a short period of time and we look at their immune response to that one vaccine. That says nothing about what it's going to do for your overall health. So that's what's been missing. That's what this study did. Statistically significant, very powerful. And the thing is, Taryn, it's not the only study. If this was just a lone study, you could say, oh, he must have done something with that data. No, the data is sound, even though the study got retracted later, which you can anticipate. Almost every study that shows vaccines in a negative light gets retracted. The other thing that happens is they discredit the author. Well, how do they do that? 5 days after this study was available online, they yanked my license. It was an emergency suspension. The emergency was I was a threat to public health. I'm not quite sure how that was an emergency all of a sudden, just because I published some literature. But there you have it. So fast forward to the last week, couple weeks, and the medical board is just continuing to paper me with requests and complaints. These aren't patient complaints, by the way. At least it doesn't appear they are. It's just, they're just creating things. I'm now under a gag order, so I can't give any details of the actual complaints, which is interesting as well, right? So you tackle this guy and then put him on a gag order. Anyway, I decided, okay, this is an all-out fight for medical freedom. This is an all-out fight for our children. So I started drpaulsfight.com. My attorney said I need to raise $250,000 to fight them. So that's what we're doing. And I'm really grateful to be on your show.
Well, thanks for all that you're doing to stand up for its medical freedom. This is also parental rights, having a say in your child's healthcare decisions. And we'll dive into a bit more of those studies and that statistics. But you perfectly set me up here to talk about just the stigma behind informed consent. Recently, Merriam-Webster changed the definition in the dictionary of what anti-vax is. As you said, you are not anti-vax. Children in your pediatric office, they do get vaccinations. And so many Americans are not anti-vax, just are questioning this particular COVID vaccine in general and everything that's behind it. The new Merriam-Webster dictionary definition of anti-vax is, to quote, a person who opposes the use of vaccines or regulations mandating vaccination. You've experienced, as you just outlined, pushback on just trying to have informed consent behind vaccines in general, not just this COVID vaccine, but vaccines in general. And you've been experiencing that pushback for the last couple decades. How do you think that stigma behind just merely asking questions about what we're injecting in our bodies and in our children's bodies has gotten us to this point with this particular COVID vaccine?
Yeah, when you call somebody anti-vax, that is a label, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's sort of a way of discrediting a person and avoiding the actual issue. Almost everyone who is labeled as anti-vax was a former vaccinator. I mean, my kids are all vaccinated. And what happens is when you have injuries from vaccines and then the establishment denies that those injuries happened, you've got millions of parents at home with injured children, whether it's chronic disease and I know they want to crucify me for making any connection with autism, but I'm sorry. I've had parents, hundreds, come and tell me the story. I'm not making this up. They got this vaccine or a series of vaccines and they lost their kids, sometimes immediately, sometimes over weeks, sometimes over months. The data bears it out. My study and others are showing there is a link. Nevertheless, you become aware there's a problem, and rather than acknowledging that problem, they just call you anti-vax. So it's just a label. What we are is vaccine risk aware. So take that terminology to the current COVID situation, and you're absolutely right. Informed consent is the key issue here. When you have a mandate, by definition, there's no informed consent. Okay. And so this is what's happening. Adults across our country, I think 2/3 at least have now had at least one. And most, I would say, either were simply tricked by all the messaging and the fear mongering in the news, or were literally coerced because they were going to lose their job. They were not going to be able to travel. I mean, I know a doctor who's well aware of the risks of this vaccine, didn't want to get it, but he had to go do a presentation in Europe that was very, very important to him, got the vaccine and almost died. It took him 4 hours and he was still unable to document it in the VAERS. So there's a system set up to capture these vaccines, and he couldn't get it to happen. And he's reported before. So we've got a failure of the system to capture all the injuries that are happening. We've got censorship that's blocking stuff. I mean, crazy amount of censorship. You can't get the word out to the public that this vaccine is causing problems. And then you've got mandates that removes informed consent. It's a recipe for a disaster. And honestly, Taryn, I think they've overplayed their hand. The childhood vaccine schedule has sort of slid through as the way to go. This is the right thing to do. This is how you protect your children. And by not allowing people to see the vaxxed, unvaxxed data, such as that I've published and others recently have published, there's a few articles now that are pretty robust, pointing to a very, very strong signal that vaccines are part of the problem. It's not the only problem. It's a big part of the problem, though. Well, with COVID, they're not going to be able to deny it. I mean, pretty soon, everybody's going to either have personally experienced health consequences or they know somebody who has. And when it gets that bad, people are going to start refusing their boosters, those who got a vaccine already, and those who haven't got a vaccine, they're going to go, no way, right? You just draw a line in the sand. There is no way I'm taking that shot. Some people are trying to call it a vaccine. It's interesting. You were talking about the change in the definition of informed consent. They've changed the definition of a vaccine as well in the US government system. And while vaccines used to prevent infections and prevent transmission, well, that's not happening with COVID. So they've had to redefine what a vaccine is to try to slip this through as a vaccine. Folks, this shot is genetic material being introduced the mRNA, and even the J&J shot, which is DNA, gets converted to mRNA that enters your cells and turns your cells into a spike protein manufacturing factory. Now, spike protein is the toxin. Spike protein is the problem. The hope was, I mean, in the beginning, it sounded great. The hope was that spike protein attaches to the cell, your immune system recognizes, you mount an antibody immune response, boom, now you're protected. It's not working out. The spike protein is getting into the bloodstream. It's going all through the body. If it's in the brain, attaches to those cells, now your immune system's attacking your brain cells. If it goes to the gonads, your testes and ovaries, now you're having your immune system attacking your testes and ovaries. We don't know what the long-term consequence will be to fertility, but it's very worrisome. And then there's the whole massive inflammatory issue that happens and the blood clotting issues that are happening. We got a disaster on our hands, honestly. And I'm a pediatrician. So for kids, here's the big thing. COVID vaccines for kids. Now, this will be labeled as misinformation or disinformation, and I will hear about it from the medical board for saying this. But the truth is this. I have over 10,000 patients, not a single one ended up in the ER to my knowledge. Certainly none were hospitalized and none died.
The children.
None of the children, no children, actually none of my parents either, but none of these children have died, been hospitalized, or to my knowledge, been in the ER for COVID disease, the illness. I did already have a child who was hospitalized for myocarditis after getting the shot. I have not seen a case of myocarditis in my entire career. 35 years of busy pediatric career in a multi-person's practice. I don't know how many millions of lives that is, zero myocarditis. Now there's already a case, and the data that it's out there, it's showing that your risk of being hospitalized with myocarditis as a child is at least 4 to 6 times greater than your risk of being hospitalized from the infection.
And even just recently, Japan was alerting its population to that. Twitter tried to suppress that information and labeled it, as they tried to suppress it. But Japan was even telling its citizens, especially young males, that myocarditis, they're seeing an increased risk after getting these vaccinations. And you talk about too, just with vaccines in general, and obviously with this COVID shot, you have to weigh the risks, right? Of what you're injecting in your body versus what you're trying to prevent. And specifically, as you're saying with children, you don't think that the risk outweighs in this scenario.
Exactly. So informed consent, parents, listen, if you're a parent and you're listening to us, remember, it is absolutely up to you to protect your child, right? From whatever dangers are out there in the world. The largest danger, the biggest threat that's out there right now that your child is going to face is getting this COVID shot, because they are at zero risk of death from the illness. They are not at zero risk of death from the shot. Kids are dying. Myocarditis, permanent heart damage, massive numbers coming in now. So yeah, we're not giving informed consent. People are just being told to do it, and they're being coerced to do it. Otherwise, what? Your kids can't go to school. Your parents can't work.
Taking a quick break to encourage you to head over to wethepatriotsusa.org. This is how you can get directly involved in your fight for our freedoms. Hit the donation tab on the homepage. Your tax-deductible gift will assist this 501c3 organization with protecting your medical freedom, parental rights, educational freedom, religious freedom, First and Second Amendment freedoms, and so much more. Head to wethepatriotsusa.org now. And back to our discussion with Dr. Paul. I've been reading your book, The Vaccine Friendly Plan. You have a lot of prenatal care in there as well. I'm 26 weeks pregnant. And I think that's been very surprising for me. When you walk in to your OBGYN office, they give you a long list of things that you cannot take while you are pregnant.
Right.
Yet they have been very much pushing this shot on pregnant women that we don't know the long-term effects of. And I think that that's been a very personal, eye-opening experience for me, to be told I can't take cold medicine, but yet I'm supposed to take this that could put at risk my unborn child. And, again, the myocarditis, different things that could factor into what we're doing here with this vaccine. The risk reward scenario is something that I think what you're trying to get the point across is informed consent on all of this. And let's dive into as well some more of this information that you have in your book, because I think that it does go hand in hand with the COVID shots, and just knowing the information, educating yourself. I think what really stuck out to me in your book is that kids today get 4 times the amount of vaccines that they did 30 years ago. Let's dive into some of this data. Do you think that that's what's leading to the increase in what we're seeing with allergies and learning disabilities and things like that? Just the sheer amount of vaccines. I myself have children now. Just the amount that they recommend for kids, they're saying your kid should go into the pediatrician's office and get 4 vaccines at a time, let alone every single wellness
sometimes
checkup
6
that they
vaccines
have
at a time.
Yeah. Do you think that this 4 times the amount kids are getting these days compared to 30 years ago is a contributing factor in all of this?
Absolutely. It's a combination of a couple things. I mean, Paul Offit, who's a huge vaccine promoter, and he has been quoted saying you can give a kid 10,000 vaccines at once, they'll be fine. And he's trying to refer to the antigens with the theory, and it's a crazy theory, but I understand where he's coming from. Our immune systems are designed to handle multiple bacteria and viruses. I mean, our bodies are loaded with viruses and bacteria, hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands, right? So sure, our immune system can handle that. But what he misses in that sort of thinking is it's not just the antigen that's in the vaccine, it's the other poisons that are in those shots. And that's where the problem lies. So vaccines have a very toxic level of aluminum. Half of them have so much aluminum. It's known to be creating autoimmunity and direct toxicity to neurodevelopment. So those are a couple known mechanisms by which these vaccines are causing problems, and we're jamming them into the first 2 years of a kid's life. So the other problem is this phenomenon called immune activation. It's well documented, lots of peer-reviewed science on this. And the rapid vaccines at a very young age overstimulates the immune system and shifts it towards allergy and autoimmunity. You therefore are less able to handle infections, which is exactly what my research ended up showing. So too many, too fast is both a toxic load that little kids can't handle, or even adults for that matter, but it's especially rough on the young child who has smaller body mass. I mean, it's just less renal function, kidney function. Kids don't do as well just because they're tinier, but also too many, too fast when the immune system's immature. I think it's just really disrupting your natural process of recognizing self from non-self. And you get the immune system confused, and then you have autoimmune problems, allergies like you were talking about. And this is what we're seeing in pediatric practices where they're following that schedule. And I don't see as much of it at all in my kids who are unvaccinated.
You mentioned your study that you recently shared, and I'm assuming people can get it on drpaulsfight.com as well. People can take a look at that. And there's other studies that you've cited, like the Mawson study and things like that, that show just the disparities in the vaccinated versus the unvaccinated in, the learning disabilities, the ADHD, the ADD, and the autism. Can you dive into a little bit of that, of what you were seeing in your study?
Sure. So the developmental issues we're seeing robust as far as behavioral issues, learning problems, and ADD, ADHD. There was a connection with autism and more vaccines, although it didn't hold out to the very end. And there's some reasons I think that's the case. In my practice, people become aware that there's a connection just because we are aware, and they stop vaccinating. So that might explain a little data point in my study. But the other studies, Mawson's study, Dr. Brian Hooker and Neil Miller have done a couple published recent studies that are finding the exact same links, very high, statistically significant. And then there's another very interesting study, the controlgroup.org, and anybody can go on and pull that data up. It is powerful. It mirrors almost exactly all the things I've found. And what they did in that study is they polled unvaxxed individuals from 48 of the 50 states, and they looked at their rates of all these conditions, and they were like almost absent in the unvaxxed. Even things like heart disease and cancer, just zero. Zero diabetes in the unvaxxed. It was like, wow. And zero ADD, ADHD in the adults who were unvaxxed. My own data showed no ADD or ADHD in the unvaxxed. It was like, that surprised me. I'm sure there will be some that develops just because of the age group that we were dealing with, but still, for there to be none. I mean, my study covered everybody born into my practice, so maximum age was 10. And obviously ADD, ADHD is something that develops. You start diagnosing it usually around 4, 5, 6. So there'll probably be some, but none so far in the unvaxxed. It speaks highly to the fact that there's something going on with our vaccine program that's just too much. I think it has to do with the things I was telling you about, the direct toxicity and the immune activation. It's just too much too soon, and we need to relook at it. I'm not anti-vaccine. We need safer vaccines, and we need a better schedule. We need to compare schedules. If different countries have different schedules, let's look at the differences in health outcomes. The United States has one of the worst infant mortality rates in the entire world when you compare industrialized countries. We're at the bottom. We also have the most aggressive vaccine schedule. Is that a coincidence? I doubt it. Just based on all the data that I've been looking at, I don't think that's a coincidence. It's a wake-up call. It's a shot across the bow. Parents, if you're listening, pay attention to this. I also just have to clarify for your listeners, because you've been mentioning my book, The Vaccine Friendly Plan. That book was written in 2016. I wasn't aware of all this vaxxed, unvaxxed data that we now have. And my own data, this amazing study that I published and that I'm sharing with you all, this data, those orange lines, those are vaccine-friendly vaccinated kids. Those are not CDC vaccinated kids. That means the vaccine-friendly plan is not friendly enough, okay? I use the word friendly to sort of say, maybe this might be a better way, something to consider. Well, if you're vaccine risk aware, because I've met a couple people, and it breaks my heart, who followed the vaccine-friendly plan and they have a vaccine-injured child. And it's clear from my data that's happening. Right? So even the vaccine-friendly plan is too aggressive. I published an article with Jack Lansweiler and a couple other co-authors a couple years ago on aluminum, and we looked at the aluminum retention in the body of kids on the CDC schedule compared to the vaccine-friendly plan. And on the CDC schedule, kids, their first 7 months of life, were spending 30 to 70% of their time above toxic levels for aluminum. Imagine doing injections so aggressively that 70% of the time your kid is in a toxic state for the whole first 7 months of development. I mean, no wonder my kids at that age, they sort of laid there and stared off like they had a blank stare. They were so poisoned. Sorry, kids. I didn't know, right? I mean, and the beauty of okay, parents, when you know better, you do better. The other thing I want to tell you is don't feel guilty for what you've done that you weren't aware of. That doesn't help anyone. And the beauty I was going to say about kids and the immune system is that it does recover. We are wonderfully made. And if you just stop the poisoning, stop the toxicity, and promote detox, good nutrition, there's other things one can do, then your body starts healing, and there's recovery available for you. Even, I believe, with the COVID shot. That one's tricky because when you get into autoimmunity, and it seems to be a big trigger of autoimmunity, autoimmune conditions are some of the toughest conditions to treat as physicians.
Hearing that you would make some adjustments to the vaccine-friendly plan that you published in 2016, and given what's been going on in today's climate, are there still some vaccines that you would recommend to people, or do you recommend to stay away from them personally? Maybe I've read some articles that you have mentioned that if you had kids today that you would possibly not vaccinate them. Is that true?
Yeah, so I'm not allowed to give medical advice. That's a board order. I'm trying to keep my license. So this is just chatting, informational purposes. Personally, what would you think, Dr. Paul? Yeah, I would think very seriously about whether or not I'd want to do any vaccines, given what I now know. I definitely would not be doing anything in a hurry. I mean, there may be situations where you're going to pick a specific vaccine for a specific situation, and that would just be It all depends on your tolerance of certain risks, right? I mean, vaccines have certain benefits. Some of them are pretty effective. I mean, the MMR, measles, mumps, rubella, is pretty effective at reducing measles and rubella, 80% effective on mumps. The varicella vaccine that I don't think we need. We all had chickenpox, my age group, and it was no big deal, right? So that vaccine was not introduced because we needed to eliminate chickenpox. It was introduced to keep parents working. Is basically, I remember when they brought that out in 1995. So there's all these complicated issues of, would I do this vaccine, and if I would do it, at what age, right? And so it's a deep discussion that takes a lot of time. And as a parent, you have to dive in yourself, right? So you can take my vaccine friendly plan as a place to start. If you're thinking you want to follow the CDC schedule, then at least it's a good place to start. So you can go, oh, hepatitis B for newborns, that doesn't make any sense. You catch hepatitis B from sex and IV drug use, and most of the babies in my practice, they're not having sex and they're not sharing dirty needles. In fact, all of the babies in my practice are not doing those things. And as long as the birth mother, if you're a birth mother and you don't have hepatitis B, you absolutely would not want, scientifically speaking, to give that vaccine. Now, if you want to follow orders from doctors or public health people or CDC officials, people who profit from the industry, if that's where you want to get your information, from those who profit, then that's your choice, right? And we still live in a free country. Our freedoms are being taken away by this mandate process, but you're free to make your own decision. It's just get informed, because once informed, I'd say I have one patient, maybe two in my practice, two families that are following the CDC schedule. And everybody else, once they're informed, they make different decisions.
And that's what a lot of people out there, fighting for medical freedom, that mandates or these CDC schedules are very much a blanket scenario. And, people that are fighting for medical freedom are fighting basically for personalized medical choices, and that, every person, every family, everybody is different, and that people should be able to tailor their medical needs to them personally, and it not be just a one size fits all. I hear that coming from you. I also want to get the perspective of you as a doctor, growing up through your career in the medical community, and how these vaccines from a business standpoint are presented to you and your practice. Do you think that has a lot to do with how doctors approach the subject as well?
So that's an excellent question. I actually published a paper just this past year showing the financial incentives to vaccinate. And what I did for that paper was I took 1 month's worth of super bills. So every patient that checks into our office gets what we call a super bill, on which we mark all the things we do. And then that gets to the billing department, who submit the bills to insurance, and we get paid. Well, on the back of the super bill is the vaccine, all the vaccines that can be given. And every well visit, we check off what the CDC says you're supposed to do. And then parents refuse what they don't want to do that we're telling them they should do according to the CDC schedule. So we were able to track exactly which vaccines, and even by insurance company, because insurance companies will reimburse us at different rates. So this article was to the penny. Every dollar we got when we vaccinated, and every dollar we lost when parents refused the CDC schedule that we were recommending to them. And I say recommending, just we're telling them this is what's recommended. We then do informed consent, and that changes their decisions, of course, because they're more informed. But we found that my practice lost $1 million a year from just the administration fee. Pediatricians aren't aware of that. And if you're a doctor, you're watching this, you're probably going, no, that's not so. Well, in my practice, it is so, because so many parents are refusing all the vaccines or most of the vaccines. And that is a massive financial hit to my bottom line. We're struggling financially, even though we're providing comprehensive care. And that's because the way pediatric practices are structured today, the financial incentive is so great to vaccinate that I don't think there's very few practices that would survive without the money that comes from vaccines. And I used to deny that as a pediatrician until I actually looked. It's like, oh my gosh, they have pumped up those incentives in terms of what they call the admin fee, which is just a thank you for administering this vaccine. It takes all this time for the nurse to draw it up and inject it, and it takes all this time for the doctor to go over informed consent, which doctors aren't doing. They're just handing you a vaccine information sheet. Here's your vaccines. The nurse will be right in, and boom, you get your shot and you're done before you even had a chance to think about it. In my case, we will sometimes spend 15, 20, 30 minutes discussing vaccines. Parents decide after the discussion, sometimes they don't want to do any vaccines, and we just lost all that money. So it's rather a ridiculous business choice to do informed consent. It's costing a boatload of money. So no, there's no financial incentive not to give vaccine. The incentives are all to give the vaccines.
And those financial incentives, are those coming from the companies producing those vaccines themselves, or the insurance companies, or a little bit of both?
No, it's from your reimbursement from insurance companies. And that's why it's different by each company. And so when I published that data, we just listed them as A, B, C, D, E, F, G, because we're not allowed to disclose what our contracts are with various companies. But yeah, this is built into the system to incentivize vaccination. And it's just, I used to wonder, I still do to some extent, if you have an organization like Kaiser, let's say, and they pride themselves on managing the costs and having a healthy population. Well, if Kaiser understood the data that I have in my practice, and I know they've got that data, they're sitting on it. If they looked at their unvaxxed patients and compared them and age matched them to vaccinated patients, they would see the same thing I saw. The unvaccinated are so much healthier. Think of the money they could save by having a healthier population. You're spending less on vaccines. You're spending less on office visits. You're spending less on chronic disease. They would save a bundle. So why aren't they doing that? Well, they are massively incentivized by the pharmaceutical industry to do the vaccines according to the CDC schedule. And there's all sorts of ways they do that. Research money that comes to them. And I don't even totally understand it. Other big companies, the incentives are weird. If you're an administrator of a health plan, you get paid in a way a percentage. So the more you spend, the more you make. And so they're not incentivized to actually spend less. They're actually incentivized to spend more and grow. And so the whole way, it's weird how money corrupts.
Let me play devil's advocate here for a second, and following up to, that question of if vaccines do have these risks, and the data that you're seeing is showing that unvaccinated or less vaccinated individuals have less health problems, would their counter argument that children and adults that are not vaccinated are a public health threat? Is that a valid argument?
Not at all. So that is one of their arguments, right? The greater good is that we're all vaccinated because it's those darn unvaccinated people are putting everybody at risk. Well, my data tells the opposite. Sick people get other people sick, right? We're talking about infections here. Vaccines are for infectious diseases. So if vaccines are reducing infectious diseases, then vaccines are helping the greater population. But no, the data shows the opposite. Not just my data, all the studies that are doing a good deep analysis. The vaccinated are sicker with infections. And so they are causing more harm to the entire society, including other vaccinated kids. So you come into my waiting rooms, I have a sick and a well waiting room, and my sick waiting room is empty. What the heck? My well waiting room is standing room only most of the time. Something's going on there. You're not, the unvaccinated who are healthy are not causing anybody any harm. The other argument that they'll make is, well, these horrible diseases, we're going to go back to the dark ages if everybody were to stop vaccinating. I'm not proposing that everybody stop vaccinating. The vaccine rate in this country is so incredibly high. Most people believe so heavily in it. We just want people to have the freedom to have informed consent and do what they wish. But even, Taryn, I went through this analysis once when I was on the High Wire with Del Bigtree 2-3 years ago. And he asked me, well, what would happen, Paul, if nobody vaccinated? So we went there, and I went disease by disease by disease. And in most cases, it'd be no big deal. In the case of measles, we would have a recurrence of measles with deaths, but not at the rates they used to be. You see, a population that has adequate vitamin A levels does quite well with measles, but would there be some deaths? Absolutely. So that's why it's not an easy decision, and it's not clear cut that there's only, an absolute right and an absolute wrong. There's a give and take. But overall, if you look at all the data, I think most people alive today would be healthier and better off if they weren't vaccinating. That's just what the data is showing. We need more data, not less. And unfortunately, they don't have the will. They, being the institutions that should be looking at this, are sort of captured by the money that comes from pharma. And so they don't have the will to look.
What I'm also hearing, and correct me if I'm wrong, and in that response to if some of these diseases were to come back if we stopped vaccinating, is that the beauty of modern medicine, and that now we do have better treatments and more treatments available for these things that might occur, which kind of brings us then full circle to the COVID-19 shot, right? There are treatments if you get COVID available, that the vaccine isn't the only thing that's available to you.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And even the measles example that I was giving, the infectious disease people will say, well, it would be unfair to allow measles to come back because there are people who are immunocompromised who cannot get the vaccine. And that's true. So there would be a slight increase in risk to a certain subgroup, and maybe for the health of the population, you make that trade-off. But you got to look at the full risk and benefit is all I'm saying. And people who are vaccinated against measles have protection. So you don't need to be afraid of those people who want to take their own chances with it. That's fine. And the other thing people should know is that if you're in cancer chemotherapy, that's the classic case that said, well, we have to protect the poor kids who are under chemotherapy, or adults for that matter. When your immune system is severely suppressed by chemotherapy, they don't let you out of the house, because it's not just measles. It's hundreds, thousands of infections you're at risk for. So it's not just the 14 things for which we have a vaccine. So that argument doesn't totally flesh out, really. But back to COVID, repeat your question. Sorry, I lost it.
And that this all ties together, that we have, that we have treatments for, like you said, for measles, and then, tying it into COVID-19, that the vaccine isn't necessarily your only option, that if you were to contract COVID, that there are other things out there.
Absolutely. So I am in close communication with multiple physicians who are treating cases of COVID, hundreds and hundreds of them, and having 0 deaths, from the beginning of the pandemic. And what they're using are the available things, most of them natural. And in some cases, it's oh my gosh, they're using ivermectin, which has been used for decades safely around the world, but now apparently it's not going to be safe for us here in the United States. There are lots of things. I mean, just having a robust and adequate vitamin D level, not just adequate, but have a strong vitamin D level, that alone would probably keep you from dying from COVID. It's such a powerful booster of your natural innate immune system, and that's the part of your immune system that protects you the most. They have tried to suppress the information that there are treatments because it was required for them to suppress those to be able to have their emergency use authorization. So this was a very clear operation from the beginning to suppress anything that might be useful. But a lot of smart doctors figured it out. I mean, Dr. McCullough has been all over the world talking about this. He's probably the most informed, educated doctor on COVID. 40 articles he's published about it. I mean, you can get this information, folks. You don't need to be afraid of COVID. And fear is actually very bad for your immune system. So I would turn off the news that's fear mongering. I mean, I can't watch it. I haven't watched it for about a year. Every time I would turn it on, trying to just see what other people are hearing, it was like, this is just beyond ridiculous. It's not the truth. Oh, we follow the science. What science are they looking at? I have no tobacco science for sure. It's not good science.
What would be some parting words that you would have for our listeners? You have had to probably, I'm assuming, educate and encourage your patients throughout, the past decade or so in your practice, that have dealt publicly with the stigma of informed consent. How would you tell people to stand strong in their beliefs, to empower themselves, to educate themselves, and to have those civil conversations with people about all this?
Yeah, talking with our family who are thinking a different way is one of the most difficult things indeed. Meet people where they're at when it comes to how you talk to others. But, I'm a pediatrician. They are coming for our kids with this genetic therapy that will do harm, untold harm to your child is possible and actually probable. So parents, you on this one, I'm sorry. I just have to say no, no matter what, because they're not at any risk from COVID itself, the disease. It has already mutated to a very mild form. There's nothing to worry about. And the natural immune system in kids handles it perfectly. But mostly I want to say it in my parting words to everybody that's listening. Move away from fear, get back into faith, and get back into the knowledge that your natural immune system is absolutely amazing. Do everything in your power to boost that. So that means eating real food, whole food. You do need to supplement vitamin D at very high levels and check your vitamin D level, get it in the 50 to 80 range, and then get rid of stress in every form. It certainly means turning off the television. Get with others. We do best in community. Hug your kids, hold hands with your loved ones. We need human touch, all those things that will get us back to feeling like everything's going to be okay. And you know what? It will be okay. But you've got to embrace the fact that we're in strange times, and it's going to require some fortitude and some determination that no matter what, you're going to stand for your principles here. This is one of those moments in history where those who stood for what was right and for the principle of informed consent and bodily integrity and refused to be bullied, you will join those of us who are going to make a massive difference. Go to drpaulsfight.com. What's beautiful there is if you don't have any funds to help out, and I realize it's hard times for so many people, this is a battle for our kids. There's a place there for prayer. So you can just click on that button. I believe in the power of prayer. There's also a place where you can just share. So you can join the team even if you don't have funds and just get involved. Let's turn this thing around.
Thank you so much for your time today, Dr. Paul. Thank you for all that you're doing to stand up for medical freedom. And I know my family, and I encourage all of our listeners out there to shower your mission with prayer. So thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you, Taryn, for having me on your show. All the best.
I encourage you to get out there and do the research for yourself, and don't take everything that he said for gospel. That's what he's encouraging you to do, is to go out there and empower yourself and to make personal medical decisions for you. So make sure to do that, and also to visit wethepatriotsusa.org, where they are fighting for your right to make those personal medical decisions, fighting for your parental rights to make those decisions for your children and for your family as well. Head to wethepatriotsusa.org. And as also Dr. Paul alluded to, fear is very powerful. And I encourage you, remember to choose faith and freedom over fear.